morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is week 9 of the Introduction to Culture Studies, and today it's the third part of our discussion of the body and family matters. And today I'd like to talk with you about the questions connected with parenthood. This is, of course, the follow-up from the previous week when we talked about family life and the historical forms of family life. So here, just to start, we have a kind of recollection from the previous week with all the historical forms of family life lined up. So the open lineage family, the restricted patriarchal nuclear family, the closed domesticated nuclear family, the Victorian family, and onto the modern family that starts to develop in the 20th century. If you do not remember that, please consult week 8 materials when all these forms of family life were discussed. What I would like you to remember the most is, of course, that when we talk about private matters and private life, all kinds of arrangements and all kinds of forms of family life can be found practically at any historical moment, but only a limited number of these behaviors is seen as dominant or mainstream or advisable or even given some sort of moral value by the people living in those times. So you probably could find some families that did not conform to the ideal, but it doesn't mean that the ideal wasn't there. You always have some sort of dominant cultural forms of private life, and it depends really on the historical moment how the non-conforming types are treated, whether they are tolerated or neglected or kind of negated even, or perhaps even persecuted. It really the cultural variation here is quite big. But of course, most of these families had children, they produced children. If you remember from last week, there was a quotation from Bronisław Malinowski, who even believed that marriage in itself developed as a social way of dealing with private life and sexuality, so that the concept of legitimacy of children could be introduced. So this is once again a biological thing with a lot of cultural resonance. So the human reproduction, of course, is rooted in biology, but different cultures deal with it differently. So let us now look at different ways why people, how they explain why they have children. Of course, the list is far from complete and exhaustive, and if you have children yourself, or if you know somebody who has children, and if you ask them why they decided to have them, you might have different answers, of course, but here are just some popular answers from, let's say, the current times and the current modes of social behavior. So, for example, some people just love babies and small children. They like caring for them. They find them beautiful and charming, and they want to have them around. They want to carry on the family name or values or some inheritance, like, I don't know, the noble title, but more often, let's say, a family business. they want to give to somebody related to them. They want someone to look after them in their old age. This is quite a common explanation, which nowadays is less important than it was historically before the old age pensions and the welfare state, but it's still important for many people. They want to give meaning to their lives, so a more philosophical explanation referring to the pursuit of purpose and meaning in one's life. They want to give unconditional love. Again, a personal, philosophical explanation. But the incentive to have children can come from outside as well. For example, it is expected by their family members. So either a partner or the parents or other family members insist that people, especially shortly after they marry, they start producing children. Or it is required by their religion. Most religions think very highly of motherhood and parenthood, and want the members of the religion to multiply. Also, another personal motivation, they want to create life and mold it for whatever reasons, usually to perpetuate the values they believe in. So as you can see, it's a complex situation, and there are all kinds of different explanations why people decide to have children. Some people, they just don't think about it at all. They go with the flow. So when they start having sexual relations, they kind of assume that children will appear sooner or later. This was the situation for most of these historical forms of family life before the effective contraception, before the understanding of the biology of conception and how children are created. So for many centuries this was basically taken for granted. Nowadays, in the modern society, we have more cultural involvement in the question of having children and reproduction, so much so that a recent, relatively new phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, has been observed, and it has been called repronormativity. If you remember our talk about sexual orientation and gender issues, there was a term heteronormativity, which means that heterosexual relations are seen as a norm in the society. So the society acts as if this is the best option, or sometimes even the only option. The same kind of thinking can be applied to having children as well. So repronormativity is the cultural belief that reproduction is the cultural norm. So what it leads to are some cultural beliefs like the ones listed here. For example, that you are not a family if there are no children, or you are not fully mature as a woman or as a man if you have not conceived a child, that you are not a true woman or a true man, whatever the culture believes it to be, without children. Or perhaps if you love somebody, you should want to have children with them. Or having a child is not a personal decision, but a duty towards the community. Or care about children should be the most important concern of laws and politicians, or even the state should help people with children and or punish those without them, for example, by imposing higher taxes on them. So I hope you can see how the culture develops around a biological phenomenon of reproduction. So it gives moral values to behaviors concerning reproduction. It creates identities for people with regard to their choices, referring to reproduction. And of course, it promotes certain behaviors, such as, of course, that marriages should aim to reproduce. This is no longer left to the personal decision of the people involved, but the society, including the laws and the politicians and the tax regulations, tries to influence the decision of the people. So that's probably the current state of culture regarding reproduction. But if we again look at the historical perspective, we see that it has never been one way of looking at children or understanding children, or basically even understanding what it means to be a good mother, a good father. So this is also taken from Stone's book, and we have some ideas, historical ideas concerning children. So as you can see, they could be very different. They could even be opposing. For example, in the 17th century with the Puritans, children, newborn babies, were basically seen as evil, naturally evil, because they were born with the original sin. So the purpose of upbringing was to get rid of this natural evil. Then, to use John Locke's idea of tabula rasa, so the blank slate, children could be seen as neutral. They are completely blank, they are as a blank page, and they are completely molded by experience. So if they have good experience in their life, they will be developing into good people. If they have bad experience, they might develop into broken or even bad people. Then we have the idea that children's personality is determined at conception. And actually this view can be shared by very old and traditional worldviews like astrology. So the influence of the stars at conception are supposed to bring some effects on the child's personality, or rather modern ideas of genetic determinism. So the combination of genes at the point of conception determines most about the future person's personality and character. Or as the utopian philosophers would believe, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, children are born good, children are perfect, and they are only later corrupted by the influence of the society. Speaking of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, here we have a slide with his views on this subject, and he was one of the first philosophers in Western culture to take interest in the children. He was one of the first philosophers to talk about the stages of the development of a human being, from the infancy to childhood to adolescence, and only then to an adult person. And in one of the most influential books by Rousseau, called Emile, or on Education, he postulated his view of perfect child-rearing practices. So he was, for example, very much in favor of maternal breastfeeding and against swaddling. You can see in this little image below what swaddling was. It was the practice of wrapping the child tightly in fabric. So this was an old practice going back to some not really verified medical knowledge that children needed support from the outside for their bones to develop correctly. Rousseau believed this was wrong, not really because it was unhealthy, but he believed it interfered with a child's freedom, and for him, even a small child should have a degree of freedom. Also, it should be the mothers rather than the servants, the wet nurses, who should breastfeed the children. Any artificial milk and bottles were either not known or not safe. Also, natural early education should come through direct experience. So book learning, the kind of education obtained at schools, should be only started when a child develops a natural need for reading, for studying in this, what was believed in a more adult way. So probably in the early teens, so much later than it is practiced today. Of course, writing in the 18th century, Rousseau still believed strongly that men had a more important and dominant role to play in the world. So his views on child rearing were very much gender dependent. And he, of course, advocated the education of women, and he introduced a character called Sophie, who would later become the wife of Emile, the main hero of the novel. But for Rousseau, the education of women should have the purpose of benefiting men, so should make better wives and mothers of the women. So that's the early stage of development of the interest of philosophers and intellectuals in childhood. Then at the turn of the 20th century and in the first half of the 20th century, we have the beginnings of psychology, and an important part of psychology, the study of psychology, is the so-called developmental psychology. That is the study of how a human character develops in childhood. This was the interesting subject for some scholars or medical doctors working within the framework of psychoanalysis, such as Sigmund Freud or Alfred Adler. Freud was mostly interested, as you know already, in the theory of psychosexual development, so how gender identity is formed in children, especially in little boys, through all these stages that he described. Alfred Adler, a student of Freud for a time, then they parted ways, was more interested in studying the complexes. He believed that humans are motivated by inferiority complex and compensation. They basically engage in constant rivalry with other people, and this is how they grow, how they develop. Later, but still in the first half of the 20th century, we have, for example, Gestalt psychology, which was developed by, among others, Max Wertheimer, and he proposed a more holistic, more complete approach to perception, to productive thinking, and this really starts a big interest of psychologists in childhood psychology, and also in the development of human personality throughout the human life. And in a moment we'll talk about some examples.